Well, hello everybody. Here we are for Chapter 20, Section 5. We're going to wrap it up today talking about water pollution with water pollution solutions. What can we do about it? Right off the bat, the main thing in trying to reduce water pollution is to prevent it. An ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure. We've got to do something to keep it from happening. We need to work with nature instead of just trying to go above it, if you will, in order to try and treat sewage. Like with our wetlands, for instance. Protect the wetlands and they'll do some of this for us. And along with that, we want to use our natural resources more efficiently. When we're talking about water pollution solutions, let's start at nature and let nature do its thing as much as possible. Now, obviously, we have got to reduce the flow of pollution coming from the land. This is where humans are, and by and large, we're the ones creating the pollution, at least the pollution that's causing us problems. We've got to reduce it, some shape, form, or fashion. We need to rethink how the land is used in order to protect our watersheds. Like that whole Mississippi Basin area, right? All that water comes in and flows into it. We need to rethink how we're using it. We've got to tie it into our energy and climate policies because it's all connected, right? Air pollution goes in, when it settles to the ground, it makes its way into the water. We get water pollution. We're dumping things in the landfills, and it rains, we have storms, and it makes it in. Everything gets tied together. So we've really got to link this into our energy use and climate policies. Everything has to get tied in together in some shape, form, or fashion. Let's talk about some of these solutions, if you will. Now, we're talking about reducing ocean water pollution. Really, we're talking about protecting the coastal water. This is where most of the ocean life is. This is where light can reach down. This is where everything is. And it's also where we're, by and large, dumping it. So we're not really talking about deep sea. We really think about these coastal waters. But we need to separate the sewage and stormwater lines. If they're tied together, one backs up and then we get sewage seeping in. But if we just have stormwater separate from our sewage water, this can go a long way to help things out. We need to require secondary treatment of our coastal sewage. Once again, in developing countries, a lot of them are dumping their sewage directly into the ocean. But even in the United States, we have some that are doing nothing more than really primary filtering, just like through a screen, to pull out the large chunks of sewage, if you will. We need to require secondary treatment of all of it. Also, we need to utilize our wetlands and other natural methods to treat sewage. If we can have wetlands before where the water's coming in, it'll take care of a lot of it for us, cutting down our costs. But we've got to protect them. We can't just drain them, develop them, put buildings on them, put farms on them. We need to use them for what they're good for, protecting from flooding and also pulling pollutants and sewage out. We need to ban dumping of waste and sewage by ships in coastal waters, whether it's cruise ships, fishing ships, you name it. They can just dump their sewage in the ocean. Well, it needs to be at a certain depth out. They have to be at the deep sea before they're dumping. Because if they're dumping right in the coastal waters, this is what's affecting everybody. You and I, where we live and play, where we fish, where all the marine animals are. That's something simple, but it needs to be done. We also need to strictly regulate coastal development, oil drilling, and oil shipping. You know, the ships coming in and out. Once again, back in 1990, we passed a law about all hulls coming into the U.S. waters had to be double hulled. Well, we really should just have all oil tankers everywhere be double hulled. But once again, it's a worldwide thing, and it takes a lot to address it. Cleanup. You know, that's all prevention, and that's where we need to start. And when it gets down to cleanup, there's not much there. We need to improve the cleanup capacities we have and develop better ones. We've talked about the nanoparticles. There's some great ideas with it, but they're really not there. We have a lot of effects we do, but when there's a big oil spill cleanup, we can still only get about 15–20% of it. And we have the huge garbage patch out in the sea, which we're not even cleaning up. So we need to do what we can and improve. Now, a lot of this pollution is coming from non-point sources. Okay, you and me, or agriculture in general, or business in general, air pollution that's filtering in. It's really hard to point to the source and therefore clean it up. Now, methods to reduce this. Use soil conservation methods. Okay, a lot of it is agriculture. We need to use fertilizers that release their nutrients very slowly. So if they do get washed off into the stream, we don't get these huge algal blooms. We need fertilizers that release. We have them. Once again, as usual, these just tend to be more expensive. Also, there should be a ban on fertilizer if it's on a steep slope. If you're farming on slopes, fertilizer shouldn't be allowed because the odds of it running off are incredibly high. There's virtually no way to completely keep it protected. We need to reduce use and runoff of plant nutrients and pesticides. Once again, some of these things, if there's a really steep slope, you shouldn't do it at all. Well, one of the things we can do is plant buffer zones of vegetation. So in the picture back here, you can see the farm coming right up to the edge, but then we have some different rows of some different plants. Well, the farm isn't going right up to the river or the runoff, and we need to have more of this. Our farm and then some buffer zones between our agricultural and the water supplies. And honestly, we simply need to set discharge standards for nitrate chemicals from sewage treatment and industrial plants. When the water gets treated, a lot of times the nitrates and phosphates are not getting pulled out. Even in a secondary treatment system, they're still in the water. We need to set standards that need to lower the amount of nitrates that are being released into the water. We need to pull them out in the tanks so we can put them back in the ground for fertilizer. We need to look at nitrates and phosphates as an asset, as something valuable, a commodity, and not simply allow it to just remain in the water source and dump it back into the rivers. Now, as a case study, reducing water pollution in the United States. We passed a lot of water laws. Once again, I've mentioned it many times. The 70s was the decade of the environment, if you will. 1972, we passed the Clean Water Act. It was strengthened again in 1977. In 1987, the Water Quality Act was ensued. Now, both of these together were trying to help get our streams, rivers, and lakes water quality cleaner so that they could just be used for swimming, fishing, recreation, etc. Only over 60% of our waterways were not suitable for fishing and swimming in. Now we've upped that to 70% are. We're not all the way there yet, but much better. In 1990, we had the Oil Pollution Act. This was the one where double-hulled ships had to be used to come into coastal waters. There were other parts with the act. Now, we've been experimenting with a discharge trading policy that uses market forces. In other words, you have a company and you are releasing really more wastewater than you should. Well, you could sort of buy your ability to put out more than you should as long as somebody else over there is. In other words, you kind of buy theirs from them. Now, of course, there's a lot of trouble with this because we say, okay, you're allowed to pollute extra because you're paying that company because they're not polluting. Well, we may have a whole bunch of companies here that are doing the excess polluting and they're buying from lots of other areas. So we wind up having too much pollution here. So it's an idea, but there's a lot of issues or problems with it. Some of the achievements of the Clean Water Act, once again, our clean water is up from where it was. And these are the benefits that we need to look for. There's still room for improvement. We want our water quality to get better, not just stay where it is, and heaven forbid it actually get worse. Now, when we talk about sewage treatment, in a lot of rural areas, people actually use septic tanks. Now, the diagram back here is showing how a septic tank typically would work. So you flush your toilet and it goes down into the septic tank. Well, in the top part of it, it goes in, the heavy stuff settles down to the bottom of the tank in a sludge, and the thinner stuff drains off into a large area under your lawn, typically. Under the lawn, it'll just be some rocks, porous area, and then we have drains around it, just a pipe with holes in it, and that liquid can leak out into this large area in your yard so that the soil can do all of the recycling, if you will. Periodically, that sludge has to get pumped out. Now, if you use a septic tank, it's very important that you don't use antibacterial soaps, that you're not using Drano or some of these things, because in a septic tank, we want the bacteria in the septic tank to break down all of these biodegradable materials. But anyway, a lot of rural areas actually use a septic tank. In most cities, we have wastewater and sewage treatment plants. Now, these can be different. We have storm drains and we have sewer drains. In some cities, these are connected, and in other cities, they're completely separate. It's much better if they're physically separate, but no matter what, you flush the toilet and this sewage goes into a primary system. The primary system just does some very simple things. We just put up a screen to filter out really some of the bigger chunks of sewage that make it down into the drain. This could be bits of food, right? Anything going down your drain, whether it's in your kitchen or in your toilet. But it gets filtered out, then it goes into another tank where we basically is a grit grinder. We try and get as much of the big heavy grit out. Then it just goes into a sediment tank, and we just let gravity let some of that stuff filter down. And in these first few systems, very simple, just a little filtering system, letting gravity do what it needs to do, we're pulling out a lot of the sludge. Then of that liquid, which is getting a lot clearer and cleaner, we then take it into a secondary sewage treatment. Now, not everywhere does this secondary sewage treatment, and we really need to have every city that has treatment doing the secondary. In the secondary, typically we come in, we do an aeration tank. We blow a lot of air in. Once again, remember, a lot of these biodegradables are very oxygen intense. They take a lot of oxygen. So we blow a lot of oxygen in so that the bacteria can do its stuff and get the stuff broken down. Then we'll send it into a sedation tank again. Once again, we'll let it sit, any of those particles to be able to sift back out again, and then we put it into, and typically we would add chemicals. Chlorine and fluorine in the United States being the most common, but we'll put in some sort of chemical additives in order to take this stuff out. Now, in some places, we have a tertiary or advanced sewage treatment. There, it runs through another system where we filter those processes again, and then we may take out some heavy metals. This is where we may actually pull out some of the nitrates and phosphates. It's more expensive. Not every area uses a tertiary system, but that's something that we really would like everywhere to move to. Once again, if we can look at nitrates and phosphates as a commodity, as something to take that we can use and get it back in the soil so it's not going into the water, everybody actually wins. Now, many cities actually violate the federal standards for sewage treatment plants. Federal law requires primary and secondary treatment. Now, there are some exemptions. If a city can show that it is too financially difficult for them to do the secondary treatment, then they don't have to. Well, the reality is the financial hardship is going to come. If you're not treating the water properly, people get sick. It's this full cost pricing again. Pay me now, pay me later. We're better off to pay me now for the clean water as opposed to people getting sick and dying and trying to do billions of dollars worth of cleanup after the fact. Health risks come from this. We wind up swimming in water that gets blended with sewage waste. Once again, when those storm drains are connected to our sewer drains, when we get a really heavy storm and it overflows, well, sewage winds up overflowing with it. Here, from time to time in Florida, you'll go to the coastline or you go to a creek and there'll be signs up, bacteria. A lot of times it's because storm drains got backed up, sewage leaked into it, and there's excess bacteria in the waterways. So there are a lot of health risks involved without doing the secondary treatment. We want to improve it as much as possible. We need to get rid of the toxic waste before it goes to the municipal sewage treatment plant, because that sludge is valuable. That sludge can be taken out, dried, and it can be used as fertilizer, and that's what we need to do with it. But if toxic waste is coming in, like coal ash or anything else, or industry, if industry's pipes are going into the same pipes as your and our houses, now that sludge is not fertilizer grade. If industries had to pay for separate piping to go to a separate cleanup, then we could make use of the sludge, and we would know we could treat theirs separately, but we would get a lot of that sludge back that we could use as fertilizer. Why don't we do it? Regulations. The industries lobby. We can't afford to do that. We wouldn't be able to, you know what? What we can't afford is people dying from getting sick from water. That's what we can't afford. Full cost pricing. The company won't go into business if it can't afford it to begin with. Or the company will come up with ways to minimize their cost. They're looking for the quick buck, the easy buck. As taxpayers, we should say, no, you need to come up ways to eliminate using toxic waste, or come up ways to treat it yourself. It should not be on us, the taxpayers, to take care of waste problems that you're creating because you're making a product. If the product has to be more expensive, then so be it. We, the customers, will decide if we want those things or not. But companies need to take care of their own toxic waste. It shouldn't come on the backs of taxpayers. Also, using a composting toilet systems. There are water-free toilet composting systems. They're odor-free. The writer of this book, or at least one of the authors of this book, used one for over 10 years in a research lab. There's a lot of ways and a lot of places that we could utilize these that we're just not currently doing. Also, we can make use of wetland-based sewage treatment systems, working with nature. We have these biological machines, if you will, to help clean up water. A very series of tanks that just involve having like water's hyacinths, kind of like a man-made wetlands, that the water goes from tank to tank to tank. And by the time it gets through the 10th tank, it's already cleaned. Doing the job of a wetland, we're just putting it inside. Some schools and businesses around the country and around Europe already make use of this as a way to integrate nature to take care of a problem. A lot of times, this is actually cheaper than a traditional sewage treatment plant. It does take some monitoring for it, but once again, it's fairly self-sufficient once it's set up. But really, it comes down to prevention. We've got to prevent the pollution. In developed countries like the United States, Europe, well, it's bottom-up political pressure. It is you and me putting pressure on our elected officials that we need to do something about it. We have to have better laws. We have to have strengthened laws. We need to enforce the laws on the books to prevent our water pollution. In the less developed countries, little has actually been done to reduce it. China has plans to put small sewage treatment plants in all of its cities. They just don't really have a timetable on having to do it. And a lot of times, it takes the developed countries being willing to roll up our sleeves, go there, and help them get some of this implemented. Sometimes it does take some aid money. Sometimes it takes people like you and me giving and donating our time to go there for a period of time and help get something going underway. The real question is, how can we avoid producing the water pollutants in the first place? Well, let's look at some of these solutions. Prevent groundwater contamination. Our recharge areas, these need to be protected. Our recharge areas, we need to make sure we have serious protections in place for the water seeping down there so that our groundwater does not get contaminated. We need to reduce the non-point source runoff, and a lot of that is going to be agriculture, so some regulations helping with that, whether it's slow-moving agriculture, nothing on the slopes, setting up some wetland buffer zones between that, lots of ways it can be done. And just with that, work with nature to treat the sewage. and to reuse the treated wastewater. Now typically what we do in places where we have primary and secondary, we clean the water, we put it back into a river source, and then down from the river source is where we're pulling it out to treat it for drinking water. So we're letting nature do a lot. We just need to up the ante there, restore our wetlands so they can do a lot of this for us. We simply need to find substitutes for toxic pollutants. We need to cease ways that are using arsenic or using lead or using chromium, some of these things that just when they get in our water system cause serious problems. Practice the 4 R's, all right? Refuse, don't do it. Reduce, reuse, and recycle. Remember the 4 R's. Refuse to buy it, refuse to use it, refuse to get it if you know it's something that causes long-term problem. Reduce what you can, reuse what you can, and recycle it when you're done. We need to reduce our air pollution. Once again, our air pollution eventually finds its way into our water. And we need to do everything we can to help reduce poverty. The greater the poverty is in an area, typically the greater the pollution is. Population tends to be higher, and they don't have the resources to care for or treat the water, and it tends to be worse. So reducing poverty on a global scale is a key thing that we need to do, along with typically when we are able to reduce poverty, to reduce population. And our population growth is something that just really needs to get under control. Now these are some solutions, and some of them are big scale, but there's still things you can do, but not just right now. But what about right now? What are some things that we can do to reduce water pollution, you and I, in our homes, in our lives right now? Well, when it comes to fertilizing our yards and in our home, use manure or compost instead of chemical inorganic fertilizer. Wean yourself off of going and buying, I don't want to really use a name brand to hurt anything, but buying a chemical fertilizer thrown in the ground. Use an organic. Cow poop. Once again, I'm fortunate enough my daughter lives near a farm, and I can just literally go get a bag and go pick up and throw the cow poop in it to use in my garden from time to time. It takes a little extra work, but there's plenty of people around there more than happy for you to come grab some of their cow poop off of their pastures. Minimize the use of pesticides, especially near bodies of water. Try and keep from using it. Once again, you want a yard that doesn't have mosquitoes in it? Buy a citronella plant. Plant the citronella plant. Put in marigolds. There are natural plants that insects don't like. Keep from spraying as much, especially if you're right at a water source. Prevent your yard waste from getting into the storm drains. Like I cut my grass and all the grass clippings go back into my yard, but I always loop a few around and shoot it towards the inside of my yard instead of spraying it out onto the street. I'm sure some of it makes its way onto the street, but I'm conscious about it. I try to make sure I keep all my yard waste in the yard, unless I'm actually throwing it away when somebody's coming to take care of it. I don't want it washing down in the storm drain, and then I just have green manure leading to the eutrophication of a stream. Don't use fresheners in toilets. A lot of these chemicals that we're putting down into the toilets to try and keep away from them. All we're doing is adding chemicals into our water that we're having to pay to treat and pull out. Don't flush unwanted medicines. Guys, a lot of times people, I don't have this, take your medicines back to the pharmacy. They will take them. They will dispose of them at no charge to you. But when you dump them in the water, these are the types of chemicals that are very persistent. They don't break down. We test water and we actually find fairly high levels of estrogen from birth control pills that have been dumped down the soil. We also find high levels of painkiller, things from like OxyContin. Well, I don't want it anymore, I'm gonna throw it away, so I don't want people to get it. Take it back to the pharmacy and they'll dispose of it for you. And don't pour pesticides, paints, solvents, oil, antifreeze, any of that stuff into a drain or onto the ground. Any of these things, whether it's oil or antifreeze, things of this nature, take it back to the auto store, AutoZone. They will take it back. They will recycle it for you. It's a free charge. Pretty much anywhere that does oil changes will take your oil. They'll take these things back. But if you have leftover paint, you have paint thinner, etc., you're not going to use, take it to the hazardous waste near your town. Every town has a hazardous waste disposal, costs nothing to go there. You pull up, you drop your stuff off. They reuse everything that they can, and if they can't, they treat it so that they neutralize it before it goes back into the ground. Guys, that pretty much wraps it up for chapter 20. Just some of the big ideas we went through. There's really a lot of different ways that we can purify drinking water. However, one of the most effective and least costly is prevention, not to pollute it ahead of time. The key to protecting our oceans, reducing the flow of pollution that comes from the air and the land and our streams, which empty into the ocean. When it comes to reducing water pollution, we need to prevent it. We need to work with nature as much as possible and use natural resources we have a lot more efficiently. Guys, that's going to wrap it up. Take care, and we'll see you next time.